Good afternoon. I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. Welcome to the inaugural Mansfield First Take, a new community education program providing rapid response efforts to educate the public on international or domestic current events that affect our democracy. Today's event, Missiles and Mayhem, features Mansfield Fellows Robert McCoy and Steve Levine. We rely on our community to carry out our mission to foster globally minded leaders of integrity with a focus on our democratic institutions and global mutual understanding, especially with Asia. For example, this presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television for future showings as part of a media assistance grant provided to our organization. And if you or anyone you know could be a great speaker or have an important topic for our next First Take, please message me in the chat box or feel free to email me through our website. Please note that our speakers today will answer all viewer questions, or as many as they can get to. So feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A box throughout today's presentation. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Robert E. McCoy. Bob writes and speaks on geopolitical events and international affairs in East Asia, particularly North Korea and its relations with other players in the region. During a 20-year career in the U.S. Air Force as an intelligence professional, Bob lived in East Asia for more than 14 years. Subsequently, he has published over 150 political analyses and commentaries in various journals focusing on Asia, been interviewed by numerous international news outlets, and been cited by foreign governments. Our moderator today is Dr. Steve Levine. Steve writes and lectures on Chinese history and politics and U.S.-China relations. During a 40-year teaching career, he taught at American University, Columbia University, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as here at the University of Montana. He has written, co-authored, edited, and translated from both Chinese and Russian some dozen books in his fields of interest, as well as published scores of journal articles, book chapters, and review essays. He has also been a critical member of the Mansfield Center, from a stint as Associate Director to his current role as a critical advisor as a Mansfield Senior Fellow. So Steve, I'd like to thank you for moderating this first take, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Dina. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all the people who are tuned into this initial iteration of the first takes, which we hope will take off, actually. I'd like to say that the legacy of Mike and Maureen Mansfield is one of the greatest treasures of the treasure state. And I believe that very firmly, and that is why I'm here with you. Before we get to Bob McCoy, I'd like to give you a capsule introduction to North Korean history, just to give us a little bit of background. After World War II, Korea regained its independence from Japan, but the country was divided in half by the Cold War. The Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla leader, as head of North Korea. Kim's effort to unify the two halves of Korea by war in 1950 failed with colossal loss of life. The Korean War ended with an armistice in July 1953. The peace treaty has never been concluded. North Korea evolved from a Soviet satellite state into a Korean dynastic kingdom. It is a one-party dictatorship and perhaps the most repressive state in the world. North Korea is about the size of Pennsylvania, has a population of about 26 million people. It is a poor country with a per capita GDP of only $1,700. It experienced a major famine in the 1990s and again is facing another one today. North Korea invests a large percentage of its national income in its military, particularly nuclear weapons and delivery systems. The country has systematically defied UN prohibitions on nuclear and missile testing and incurred international economic sanctions that have made it a rogue state. The pandemic has further isolated it and cut it off from its major ally, China. All international diplomatic efforts to bring about a stable peace on the Korean Peninsula have thus far failed. So now let's turn it over to Bob McCoy, who is the Korean expert among us, and I will engage in a conversation with him for the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Bob, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Steve. First, I want to express my appreciation to Dina and the rest of the Mansfield Center staff for hosting this event on North Korea. North Korea is a subject that's been near and dear to me for decades now, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, particularly with regard to its recent spate of missile launches. So I want to also thank you and Dina for the kind words and the wonderful introductions. It's very flattering.
Well, Bob, before we get too deep into the first take and the actual missiles, let's talk about where it is, what part of the world we're looking at. Let's look at some maps. I think you have some slides that will be useful for us to orient ourselves.
Okay, let us orient ourselves. We're going to do a PowerPoint thing here. This is the map of the world. We have North America. We are located roughly here at the Mansfield Center in this area. South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, of course, China, the Korean Peninsula here, the Japanese islands, the four main islands are here. And I also want to take this opportunity to use this slide to point out the island of Guam. Anderson Air Force Base is roughly in this area here where my cursor is. That will figure prominently when we're discussing some of the missile launches in a few moments. So this is the world to establish where we're going. The next slide shows Far East Asia, China in this beige color, North Korea in the magenta, South Korea in the blue. This is Russia, the yellow part, which interestingly shares about a 12-mile border with North Korea. The rest of this border with North Korea is China. And of course, the four main islands of Japan. Sea of Japan, East Sea, according to Korea, the Yellow Sea here. Guam is way off the map to the south, along with Okinawa. So focusing a bit inward on North Korea, here we have the border of the DMZ. Previously, it was the 38th parallel, which ran roughly in this direction. We gained some land at the end of the war on the east, lost some wonderful orchards and farmland on the south, or the west rather, and this is North Korea today. So without further ado then, I'll turn it back to you for the next question.
Well, okay, so this is about missiles and mayhem, and tell us about the missiles. I mean, North Korea has been firing off missiles for quite some time now, and I think that their technological expertise has increased over time, but fill us in as to why this is a particular important point in time for us to re-immerse ourselves in this information.
Okay, I will go to the missiles slide here. We have a number of launches starting on the 5th of January from Jagan province. I'm going to go back to the North Korea map. This is Jagan province here, and it's an interesting place. North Korea is a very mountainous country. This area here is much like the area in which we, the United States, established our Tennessee Valley Authority to provide electricity for the Manhattan Project. And North Korea has placed this province here pretty much off limits to normal citizens. And it's from this province, an unknown spot, that we've had a number of those missile launches. So we had two, one on the 5th and one on the 11th of last month. We don't know exactly where, limited access. They flew to a spot in the northeastern part of North Korea. Here's the distances and the altitudes. Now, the first missile was claimed to be hypersonic, but it reached only Mach 6. Mach 6, for example, is at sea level and 0 degrees centigrade, 761 miles per hour, about 1,224 kilometers per hour. Mach 6 is an impressive speed, but to be considered hypersonic, the benchmark seems to be Mach 10. So people poo-pooed this launch here, even though North Korea claimed it was hypersonic. On the 11th, 6 days later, the missile did reach Mach 10. Was it a new missile? Was it they tweaked it in the 6 days? We don't know. But Mach 10, that's a seriously hypersonic weapon delivery system. So then on the 14th in the afternoon on Weiju Air Base, I'll go back and show you where that is. Weiju is located here in close proximity to the Chinese city of Nandong across the Yalu River. So Weiju is there. We had 2 launches there. The missiles landed some spot in the East Sea, not in the Japanese exclusive economic zone. But of significance was both missiles were Mach 6. That's pretty impressive speed. Importantly to note, they were launched from rail cars. Now this is important. North Korea is a mountainous country. They do have some rail lines there, not as much as the United States, but still a lot of rail. And they go through tunnels because of the mountains. They have a number of tunnels in which these things can be hidden. And to be able to launch a missile from a rail car is, I think, noteworthy. The missile itself, we call it a KN-23, Korea North Model 23. It's based on the Russian Iskander model. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. 14 or 11 minutes later, we did another one, same criteria. So on the 17th, we had 2 missiles that were launched from Sunan. And I'll go back to Sunan as an airport, international airport serving Pyongyang. It's right to the south in this area. And the missiles flew to Alsum Island, which is located up here. It's important that this flew and was targeted at an area that is not too distant from the industrial complex, the special economic zone called Rasan, R-A-S-O-N. It's a major shipping point in northeast North Korea. The Russians do a lot of rail traffic through there. A lot of goods enter into North Korea and are processed in this area. So for them to target a small island here tells us that they weren't concerned about accuracy at all. That, I think, is something that we ought to pay attention to. Also, the missile, it was a KN-24. It was based on the American tactical missile system, the Army tactical missile system. It achieved a Mach 5 in flight. Again, nothing to sneeze at. And more importantly, it had some in-flight maneuvering. This is critical. Normally, when you fire a bullet in the air or launch a rocket, it goes up, it comes down. And based on the parabola, I'll show you that in a minute, that's where it lands. If you can get a missile to maneuver in flight, you are able to confuse the enemy or at least make their defensive actions a bit more difficult. So moving on to the 25th rather, we had 2 more launches. We don't know from where they were launched. We don't know where they landed. And this is because they were long-range cruise missiles. For those of you not aware of what cruise missiles do, they jump up to about 300 feet of altitude, 90 meters, and then they go along. They are programmable. They can zip through mountain valleys, go through mountain passes. Terrain avoidance is part of their makeup. And these guys remain totally undetected by both South Korean radar and American forces in South Korea. Totally undetected. We're not done. 2 more missiles on the 27th. These were some of the largest, more distant missiles, but it's a short-range ballistic missile carrying, probably capable of carrying a nuclear payload. It didn't go that far, but once again, due to a misspelling in one of my sources, it's unclear, but my belief is they were referencing that Alsum Island that I pointed out earlier. I'll go back and show you that island off in this area here. To me, that's very impressive when they send something like that, that distance, and they don't worry about destroying their very important port. This last missile on the 30th is very important. Again, from Jagan province, that limited access area, landed in the Sea of Japan. It flew 1,220 miles, and it was on a lofted arc. That's important to know because one of the reasons they do that is it's a way of testing their missiles range without overflying hostile territory. North Koreans overflew Japan once several years ago, and it created an international stink. So they didn't want to do that. They've learned that they can factor out the extended range or the probable range by extrapolating scientific parameters from this lofted arc. It was what we call the KN-17. It's an intermediate range ballistic missile. North Koreans call it the Hwasong-12. And this is the reason I pointed out Guam. This guy can target Guam. So that puts Anderson Air Force Base, where we have our B-52s, frequently stationed. Up until several months ago, B-52s were stationed there. When this missile first became known, the United States reacted by pulling B-52s away from Guam and rotating them in. That is to say, they were based back in the States, but we would send them, in the Air Force was called temporary duty, TDY, to Guam. The fact is that we still have B-52s on the ground at Andersen Air Force Base, and this missile, if it wants to, can hit them. Well, we have some things that we need to pay attention to in the future. One of them is the father, the deceased father of the current leader, Kim Jong-il. His birthday was the 16th of February. Now, I point that out because typically North Korea has chosen anniversary dates or other times of significance in which to do a missile launch or a nuclear detonation. I think that this date is not going to happen this year because we have the Beijing Winter Olympics from the 4th of February, that's tomorrow our time, already started in Beijing time, until the 20th of February. And while North Korea has thumbed its nose at China for sometimes good reasons in the past, there is no benefit to North Korea to do that today. So I think this date is probably pretty much off the table. However, the deceased grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who is the founder of North Korea, as Steve mentioned earlier, his birthday is on the 15th of April. And in the past, this date has been used to do some extraordinary events like shooting down of the American reconnaissance plane over international waters in 1969. There are other events that have taken place in the month of April to commemorate Kim Il-sung's birth. So that's a date that I would put on the calendar and keep an eye on. But unrelated to North Korea directly is the South Korean presidential election date of 9 March. Typically, to embarrass the South or to thumb their nose at the South, North Korea has done some things. Their second nuclear detonation was in this month when they had a presidential election. So we need to pay attention to that date. Those are the future dates, these two that I would pay attention to. But I want to get back a little bit to the cruise missiles and the hypersonic glide vehicle. I'll explain that term in a bit. Next slide. Those cruise missiles we must pay attention to because we have them. We know why they're valuable. North Korea finally has them. They tested them. Slip sliding through mountain valleys and all of a sudden, bang, they're there. They're not fast, but they get there because they can't be detected. They're below the radar profile. The hypersonic glide vehicles, that is a new animal. Here's a slide to demonstrate what I'm talking about. This white arc, it's a highly lofted trajectory that depicts the path of a normal missile. It's launched up, it gets to maybe 1,000 kilometers altitude and then just glides on down. And we can tell from mathematical models, if it goes up at this angle, it's probably going to come down pretty close to the same angle. And that's going to be the target right there. Those can be predicted with a great deal of accuracy. And because they're typically flying around 5 or 6, Mach 5 or 6, they're relatively easy to target, unlike a hypersonic glide vehicle. They're boosted. It's called a boost because it gets them up to hypersonic Mach 10 speeds. And it's boosted. When it hits the coast phase, separated at only 100 kilometers, 60 miles, the glider comes out. It's controlled by a communications satellite. And interestingly, North Korea claims to have controlled its maneuverability extensively using the Russian communications satellite system. So the interesting thing about a hypersonic glide vehicle is that it appears to use this arc, and one might think it's going to impact around here. Not so. It has a pull-up feature. Because of its high speed, it can trade off a little bit of that speed for a gain in altitude. And then it will level off at roughly 40 to 60 kilometers, 25 to 35 or so miles up. And it is maneuverable due to communications from the satellite. Anywhere within this magenta heart-shaped arc is where a missile that was originally thought to impact here can be maneuvered to target. So it doesn't hit here. It might intend to hit there, and it might, but it's also capable of going anywhere in and around this area here. And that's what makes it so difficult, possible impact area. This is something that only Russia and China have. China, rather, North Korea is on its way to getting there. And the United States is still on the drawing boards, talking with, I forget the name of the defense firm that's currently developing these things, but we don't have anything deployed at the moment. And that is something that ought to be of concern to us. So that's all I have to say on these things, other than we're a little bit behind the 8 ball, Steve.
Yeah, okay. Well, Bob, I feel like I've just been through a course in Missile 101. Please don't test me on it. I'd have to review all those slides and get it down straight. But the question then, let's get to some of the politics of this really. I mean, why, this seems to be an unusually large number of missile tests all at one time. Is there something in the international context or in the domestic and military politics of North Korea that makes this a particular time when so much activity is going on? And why should we, why do we need to pay attention to it at this moment in our own history?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'll start here and then move into another slide shortly. There are multiple reasons why this is occurring right now. First of all, as you saw from the number of types of missiles, we've had some short-range ballistic missiles, some cruise missiles, intermediate range, some other things. All of these missiles need to be tested to make sure that they're ready for production. Only one of them is currently in production. That appears to be the Hwasong 12, the Guam killer, as it's called. And in addition, there are some non-technical reasons. Trade with China is down 90%, in part due to, a large part due to concerns over COVID. I could get further into that, but I don't think it's quite relevant. And the North Korean economy is very bad. They've had some tough weather up there. Soviet system or socialist systems tend to mismanage their resources, and that's certainly the case once again. And so Kim is motivated to divert attention. Anytime that you can divert an internal domestic population away from its ills or its problems to an external source, it's a good thing for dictators. And that's what Kim is doing there. As I explained, the poor management has led them to a precipice, but you mentioned the situation in the early 90s. In 1994 to 1998, an adventure that the North Koreans called the Arduous March. They have a name for everything. This one was called the Arduous March. It was in a severe, severe famine. And it's thought that perhaps as much as 10% of the North Korean population at the time, barely into the 20 millions, died due to starvation and malnutrition and other ills that befall people that don't get adequate nourishment. Excuse me. So North Korea doesn't want that to happen again. In fact, in an article I saw earlier this morning, North Korea, Kim personally has admitted that they are facing some severe food times, and they're very concerned about that. And it's always good for any dictator to thumb its nose at the United States. They've been able to hold us at bay for 70 years. And so he gets a lot of publicity out of saying it's the great Satan. Actually, that's a Middle Eastern term. They just call us a bunch of other things. One of them is a curse word I won't use here, but they use it in teaching mathematics. In any case, it gives him a lot of publicity at home, blaming the United States. We have to have our defense systems because of these guys, and that's why you're hurting.
Recently, there have been renewed reports, by the way, that Kim Jong-un himself may be in serious health, facing serious health problems. Could that possibly be a factor in this in any sense?
Well, I don't know. I'd like to defer that question to a little bit later. It brings up an idea of succession. He certainly brought his sister into more and more things, but I'd like to defer that if you concur.
Yeah, that's fine, of course. Okay, well, let's bring in the United States since we're concerned with this.
Well, there's a deeper purpose in what Kim is doing here. This is a slide that I'll get to in just a couple of seconds. The deeper meaning of what's going on now has been clear to longtime Korea analysts for some time. In fact, I wrote a paper covering these steps here about 7 years ago. Kim needs the sanctions relieved. There are people in the United States claiming to be experts saying that sanctions don't work, they don't hurt. Well, ipso facto, by North Korea claiming that they need sanctions relief, that's proof that they do work. They need out from under those things. They need to get their trade going. They need to get revenue so that they can buy foodstuffs, get the economy going. So in my mind, the idea that sanctions don't work is something that it just doesn't wash. Those missiles are also intended to get America's attention, as I will explain in just a moment as we go through this slide. Now, and as we will see here, North Korea needs food or petroleum. This case, they want sanctions relief so they can start their trade back up. And what they've done is they've started some tension by doing some missile launches. Notice that they started out low and slow in the first part of January. Now we've ignored them. We haven't responded to them. They offered, well, I won't get to that yet. That comes in a bit. We chalk it up to that's North Korea being North Korea. So then North Korea does more missile launches, and they increase more tension to get our attention, and it doesn't work. And finally, the United States pays attention, and we haven't yet, but we will eventually realize we're going to have to talk to these guys about something simply to get them to stop the next step. And I'll talk about what that next step might be in just a moment. So when we finally pay attention to them and they agree to come to the negotiating table, once we get that far, after some serious negotiations in which the United States usually comes off as second best, North Korea will agree to stop its nuclear or missile programs in exchange for whatever it needs: food, petroleum, in this case, sanctions need. But invariably, history shows that once they have received that aid, whatever it might have been, North Korea soon finds a way to avoid or just stop following, honoring its commitment. And worse, step 8, when the needs and wants arise, it goes back to step number 2. So we have this, it's just, it's a bit frustrating for me, because when I wrote this paper in 2015, it was picked up by the British newspaper, The Guardian, and that caused the British House of Lords to pay attention to it. I was cited in their, I don't mean to brag, I'm just pointing out that the Brits paid attention to this. British House of Lords did too. But the United States DC State Department apparently isn't impressed with this. But it's a case, this explains 70 years of history of negotiating with North Korea. We don't seem to get it. So then that brings up the question, before we go on, is what are we going to do when those hypersonic glide vehicles are mated to North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles that do carry nuclear warheads, and they can reach all parts of the United States? At that point, the North Koreans have no need to negotiate with us. Absolutely none. They will have achieved a parity with the United States. From their perspective, that's what counts.
Yeah. Well, Bob, it seems to me that in these steps of these dance steps that you describe also remind me of dealing with a 2-year-old with a temper tantrum, in a sense, that the escalation of the temper tantrum finally gets the parent to pay some attention, and then you get into a kind of conversation with your little 2-year-old. This is much more serious stuff, I realize. But the question then that comes to mind is on the American side. I think you set forth the situation with the missiles and the motivations on the Korean side, but how serious are they? What is the purpose of these Korean missiles? Is it defensive, or is it really designed to pose a threat to South Korea that should be taken seriously, and to the United States and to our allies, Japan and our bases in East Asia? Are we underreacting or overreacting?
It depends on the context. If you rephrase the question a little bit and ask me whether or not North Korea poses an existential threat to the United States, I would say no. But then I would pause and add, not yet. We have those two intercontinental ballistic missiles, one of which can reach every part of the American landmass, even down to Key West. They have the nuclear devices, as I will be showing people in just a few moments. I think we need to take it seriously. They can reach us. Are they going to initiate a conflict in which they first attack the United States? I would say probably not. I wouldn't want to assign a probability index to it, but it's unlikely because they are smart enough to realize that if they were to attack the United States, even with conventional arms, that they would soon cease to exist. The American people would demand a response. The Pentagon would agitate for a response. We would find ourselves making North Korea glow in the dark from nuclear bombardment. I'm convinced of that. But what we need to take seriously, very seriously, is that North Korea is a clear and present danger to American troops, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but in Japan and elsewhere in the Pacific theater. Those Guam killer Hwasong-12 missiles can reach Guam. Years ago, Kim threatened to bracket Guam, 4 of them, one to the north, one to the south, one to the east, one to the west, just to let us know where things were. At that point, some negotiations, he made his point, he backed down a little bit. But we need to be concerned about that because American troops were in Korea not only to protect South Korea through honoring our treaty obligations with South Korea, but we have economic interests. It's a vital national interest of the United States to maintain security in Far East Asia. Look at go to your kitchen, go to your living room, the TV, the smartphones, the cooking devices, everything. More than likely, it's either Samsung or what's the other one? Hyundai, Kia, Toyota, Nissan, Panasonic, those things. If South Korea is hurt economically or attacked, if Japan is hurt economically or attacked, the American consumer is going to be hurt economically. So we need to pay attention to that. And there are other reasons why American troops are in the theater. We have concerns elsewhere in Asia, notably the South China Sea. That's not the topic of today, but we have valid national interests that cause us to place our troops there, and they are in direct danger from the North Korean missiles.
Yeah, let me add there too that both South Korea, Japan, of course, and also Taiwan, which we're not formally allied to, are democratic systems and demonstrate that Asians and democracy are certainly totally compatible in a context in which now China and Russia in particular are saying that their non-democratic authoritarian systems are the way that the world should go. So there's a values dimension to this as well, which I just want to throw into that. But let me move on to the question of how we got to where we are. It seems to me that yesterday was Groundhog Day. Everyone probably knows the movie Groundhog Day.
It's a beautiful segue. That's great.
And it seems to me that we're sort of been in that with the North Koreans for decades now, not just a year or two, that negotiations have been started, they haven't gotten anywhere. The two sides may sign a piece of paper that maybe a year later turns out not to have any validity. Are we stuck? Are we doing something wrong, or is there some new approach that you think that the US government should pursue in order to get us out of Groundhog Day and onto whatever comes after February 3rd in this case?
Well, yes, we have been in this position before. We've been in this position, from my perspective, for close to 70 years. And the answer to this is also clear to professional Korea watchers, has been for some time. North Korea, or the United States rather, just fails to negotiate wisely with North Korea. Give you an example, this is not to pass over the failings of previous administrations, but right now the Biden administration, we're 1 year plus into his administration, he has not mentioned North Korea once. in any of his speeches or press conferences. And that's one of the reasons the North Koreans are upset. They want him to pay attention to them. And that's why things are going to continue. Biden is ignoring that. Anthony Blinken, who was a subordinate in the Obama State Department, now Secretary of State, is continuing to press for complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. That's not going to happen. And we have a small handful of people in the DC area and think tanks around the country finally starting to say this publicly. Probably a few of them under their breaths in the past, but now it's coming out into the open. It's not going to happen, forget that. And then taking it up to today, what's going on, what's pressured the current spate of missiles is North Korea wants sanctions relief. It has offered to sign a peace treaty formally ending the Korean War. Biden and his State Department has not responded to that. But finally, when they paid attention to it, the North Koreans pulled a very slick move. I think you have to hand it to them. They said, okay, if you're interested in ending the Korean War, you first have to stop the sanctions. So they completely reversed the field. They've moved the goalposts out of that stadium. It's a totally different ballgame now. You want to end the Korean War, you've got to give us sanctions relief. And that is just a brilliant political narrative that they've created and spun it to where now the onus is on the United States. Well, so they've got that going for them. The United States has failed to respond to that in any meaningful way. And so the missile tests are continuing. Now, the interesting thing is once the Beijing Olympics are over and a few days pass, I fully expect some sort of response out of North Korea. Some more missile launches, perhaps, but they've already done that. So they need to up their game a little bit. A nuclear detonation? Possibly. There has been some maintenance work done on their test site area, which is in this part of North Korea. They made a big show a few years back of destroying the entry tunnels, and some people were fooled into thinking, well, that was the end of that. Well, no, you can go in 100 yards in another direction and line up with the existing tunnels, which remain in good shape. The mountain is structurally weak. They may move to another mountain in that area. I would not be surprised terribly if there was another nuclear detonation, but I would be less surprised if they launched a satellite missile, saying this is a test of satellites. And so you can't argue it's not an ICBM, it's a satellite missile. It would be just repurposing an existing missile to show us that they have the capability to reach anywhere in the United States without actually overflying any hostile territory like Japan or putting something off our East Coast. So I fully expect that. Now, it's interesting because if we were to ever agree to a peace treaty with them, what's going to happen is the first thing out of the North Koreans' minds after the ink dried a little bit would be, okay, we're at peace, get your troops out of South Korea, we don't need them. And if we were to ever agree to that, we have sort of left South Korea vulnerable to all sorts of things from the North. That's a topic I think that requires a great deal of discussion, certainly more than we have time for today. So,
yeah, let me ask one more question then. I mean, if the goals that the United States has been pursuing in its negotiations with North Korea to have complete denuclearization, irreversible and so forth, are unrealistic, are there any kinds of issues on which there might be some sort of smaller, small range or medium range issues between the US and North Korea that could make some progress and that could perhaps create a context in which the larger issues can be eventually addressed down the road?
well, that's a question that I think I want to add a little bit of preface to. And that is one of the reasons there's a follow-on explanation as to why we find ourselves in the position we are now with regard to North Korea. And that is we completely lacks something, a term that's now coming into favor by a few people in the DC area called strategic empathy. Now, the Chinese philosopher, warlord Sun Tzu, you can correct my pronunciation and give him a better title if you would, Steve, you're the expert. But
You got it right.
he wrote 2,500 or so years ago, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. That's not us today. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory regained, you will also suffer a defeat. That's partially true for us today. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. This last sentence explains why we have never bested the North Koreans. I'll get to that next slide in a bit. That's why we have never bested the North Koreans in negotiations. We don't know ourselves. And for the reason, that explains why we've been stuck with a failed strategy for 70 plus years. We don't understand, we don't get North Koreans' concerns, their fears, their history, their motivations. We do not have people in positions of power that make the decisions that do that. They don't have that understanding. We also are somewhat hubristic, thinking that the United States, the all-powerful last hegemon, can best North Korea. And 70 years of history proves that that's not the case. We're overconfident in our diplomatic skills. The North Koreans use English against us, and that's astonishing if you consider that's a second language for them, and it's our primary language. We have a misplaced belief in the appeal of Western capitalism and liberal democracy as an appealing thing for North Korea. If you understood the Kim regime, you would know that they don't care about their common people. That's why the 10% of the population died and they didn't break a sweat. It's why people today continue to suffer. The Kim regime's primary concern, and it's something that Washington seems to not understand, is that its own survival is primary. That's what matters, its own survival. So we have engaged in a lot of wishful thinking, and we have a tremendous lack of knowledge in things. I'm going to end this segment before I segue to your final question. Has there ever been anyone dealing with North Korea at the policy and negotiating level that, one, speaks Korean well enough to engage in successful negotiations, and two, knows the driving history of the Korean Peninsula, and number three, understands Pyongyang's perspective, and four, is not influenced by impractical or improbable administrative partisan, not geopolitical, but partisan goals. That, I think, is key to being successful in dealing with North Korea. Now, so the final part of your question is, I will phrase it like this: are we smart enough to develop a better way forward? And my answer to that is, we first have to gather our wits about us and understand things from Kim's and North Korea's regime's perspectives. We don't do that currently. We don't know what motivates them. We don't know what they care and don't care about. We'd see them through Western eyes. We need to develop the ability, strategic empathy, have the ability to see them through their own eyes. The North Koreans remember very well Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He gave up his nuclear program, and a few years later, when the Arab Spring arose, they found themselves under attack by rebels, and the United States overtly supported those rebels. That was a lesson not lost. Worse, it later became known that the United States covertly supported those rebels militarily. That was not lost on the North Koreans. Then there's the case of Saddam Hussein, who was thrown from power and executed because he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. That was clear, otherwise we would not have attacked him. So these are not lost on the United States, and it also shows very good reasons why the North Korean government has no reason to trust the United States. We promised Muammar Gaddafi this, it didn't happen, he did. We attacked Saddam Hussein. What comes out of this is North Korea's belief, and it's somewhat justified in my mind, that when the United States gets a mind to, it will invade and attack any smaller country it wishes. So these are things that are seen from the North's view. We don't have people, I think, that recognize this. And we need to forget this complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. It's not going to happen. It's the regime's, what they call their treasured sword. It's written into their constitution. It's what they feel guarantees their survival of that regime. So in my mind, the way forward is to say, they're a nuclear country. It doesn't cost us anything to say that out loud. It would give them a great deal of satisfaction. Doesn't cost us anything. And then we can go forward with developing some sort of detente, the way we did first with Russia and then later with China. To me, that is the only way out of the pickle that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think that's a wonderful way to close. And the question you're posing, are we smart enough to develop a better way forward, is relevant not only for foreign policy, but domestic policy as well. But the point I wanted to make in closing was that in 1998, when India and Pakistan first exploded nuclear weapons, we tried our best in a short term to undo that, to reverse that. And after a while realized that it was impossible. And although the administration then did not like having two new nuclear powers, we made our peace with it. So if that is a possibility with North Korea, that is something to contemplate. It raises another question which we don't have time to get into, and that is the whole question of nuclear non-proliferation. Maybe a subject we can deal with in some future iteration of the First Takes. So thanks very much. I think we now have some time for questions from the audience, and I would turn it back over to Dina Mansour to ask the questions so that, Bob, you can answer them.
Great. Well, thank you both for a wonderful discussion. And I think you've answered a lot of the questions as they've been posed. Bob, I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can focus more on your response to the questions.
I will do that. And right now, there we are.
Great. And I do, just before I go to the questions, want to address one point. You mentioned the expertise in the United States on North Korea and Korea. And just to put in a plug for one of the programs and the ways that we support Montana in the world is we have a grant from the U.S. Department of Defense to support the Defense Critical Language and Culture Program, which currently offers 13 different languages to members of the military. And one of those languages is Korean. So I hope that on a small level, we're hoping to achieve one of those goals of better understanding Korea.
I concur. It's one of the things I learned about through Terry Widener, a member of the board. And I was extremely pleased to learn that. I've maintained close relations with Owen Sears, and I've met with a couple of the people there, the Koreans. And I think it's an excellent thing, particularly to give some background to U.S. Army officers. Just as a quick aside, when MacArthur stole most of our U.S. troops for occupation of Japan at the end of World War II, a very small number were allowed to go to occupy Korea under the supervision of General Hodge. General Hodge knew nothing about Korea or Japan by that, for that matter. In fact, a briefing on board ship before he and his senior staff debarked, he said, the Koreans are the enemy. So it's good that we have some education going on for our officers.
Great. Well, let me go to audience questions, and please continue to feel free to add your questions here. And, a number of people asked again, is this a dance that just goes on and on? How can the U.S. change the cycle? And certainly, I think you've addressed that, but if there's anything else you'd like to add, please do. But let me go, there are a couple of questions about Russia, which of course is in the news quite a bit right now. We have a question about whether North Korea still has a relationship with Russia, and also how is North Korea able to use the Russian communications satellite? Is this a collaboration between the two countries?
It is, and it's good that you brought that up because we didn't address it directly. It's a bit tangential, but since the question came up, I'm happy to do so. As I pointed out earlier, North Korea shares a 12-mile border with Russia. Russia is very interested in that port city of Rajin, which is part of the Rasan industrial complex. It's a comparatively warm water port. That is, the harbor does not freeze during the winter like Vladivostok does up to the north. So the North Koreans are beneficial beneficiaries rather, of Russian interest in that regard. North Korea also sends a great number of workers outside the country under strict supervision to earn hard cash. And those workers have to pay what are called loyalty funds, which go back to North Korea in the form of hard currency. So the North Koreans have a strong motivation to work with the Russians. And Russians have a great motivation to work with the North Koreans because of the rail lines along the north coast or the east coast, running from Vlad down to Wonsan even. Russia has great energy stores, and to get them to South Korea would be a great boon. So that's one of the reasons that Russia is interested in North Korea. But going back to the days at the end of World War II, that's when Russia really held sway over North Korea. They are the ones that looked for and found a person by the name of Kim Il-sung and installed him as their person in Pyongyang. And in the early days, they are the ones that rebuilt the infrastructure that the American Air Force had destroyed. The Americans had practically flattened North Korea during that war. So the Russians built a lot of the infrastructure, and they were the ones that supplied the North Koreans with their initial batches of military supplies. But in later days, there was a falling out between China and Russia, and North Korea learned to play them against each other. And most of the military equipment that is not developed internally by North Koreans comes from China. That gets us away from the story of what we're talking about with Russia, but Russia continues to have an interest in North Korea, and North Korea will use whatever it can to get whatever it can out of Russia. I don't know if that's answered your question the way you've asked it, but that's about the sum total of what I'm prepared to discuss today.
Great.
Can I just-
Oh,
I
go
just-
ahead, Steve.
Just a very quick comment there. I mean, North Korea is a small country surrounded by very large countries, has developed a skill that other small countries do to play off its larger neighbors against each other, and using diplomacy instead of small power tricks or maneuvers in order to extract concessions from larger countries that are infinitely more powerful than they. So it's not alone in that sense, but it has played that game, as Bob suggested, quite successfully, certainly during the period of the Sino-Soviet dispute in the 70s and 80s in particular. So that's all.
Great. We have about 6 minutes left, and I'm hoping we'll get to 2 more bundles of questions here. The first one is in regard to East Asia, and you did touch on China, but let me package these 3 great audience questions. Given the tenuous US allies in East Asia with deep-seated animosity, how might Kim Jong-un exploit the political order? What would happen if he elected to attack American installations on Japan only? Should the US seek a regional alliance in East Asia similar to NATO? How has China reacted to the recent flurry of missile launches, if at all? And generally, how close are ties between China and North Korea?
Steve, did you want to handle this first, or should I go?
It's your show. If I have anything
Well,
to add.
I think we're in this boat together. I'll
That's
start
true.
then. We haven't seen much reaction out of China, at least I haven't. Steve can comment more fully on that. I suspect China is not pleased about that. I suspect that behind the scenes there are diplomatic cables going back and forth between Pyongyang and Beijing saying, boy, you better watch it. You don't want to pull the tiger's tail too much on this. But so far they haven't made it public as far as I can see. With regard to developing something like NATO, it's, in my mind, a bit of a stretch. It's not a good fit. It's not a good analogy. The countries are separated by vast seas. The Pacific is a great, huge expanse of water. And it's one of the reasons that CETO never came into being. We don't have, secondly, we don't have common cultures except for any lasting animosity toward Japan left over from World War II. That seems to have gone by the wayside, and things are coming together a little bit. We are forming something called the Quad. India, a reluctant partner, Australia, the United States, Japan, eager to get back into the game, to form a united front against Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And I want to take a moment to explain why that's important. That's a vast expanse of water through which nearly 1/3 of the world's trade flows, and it's a global commons. Nobody owns it. China claims it, but they're wrong. The International Court of Appeals in The Hague said so in the 2013 decision. Beijing refuses to accept that. Beijing is a country that refuses to play by the rules. In my mind, they want to be a hegemon, at least of the region Asia. Asia is for Asians in their minds. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to eventually learn, if I live long enough, that they have global ambitions. They are already making great inroads into Africa. They have made toeholds into South America, something the United States needs to pay attention to. But with regard to Northeast Asia, which is where I tend to limit most of my focus, we have South Korea, which is in a very tight spot. South Korea has allowed itself to be dependent upon China for trade. The last figure I saw was several months ago rather, in which fully 60% of South Korean trade is involving China. That puts them at the mercy of Beijing. If Beijing all of a sudden gets a hiccup or gets upset, South Korea suffers. So South Korea is in a hard spot. It does not want to be forced to choose between China and the United States, and it hems and haws. We've seen this particularly through the Moon administration, the South Korea's current administration. Japan, on the other hand, I read an article today which totally miscast Japan as being afraid of and going to kowtow to China. Absolutely not the case. Japan is talking about first strike capability. There have been murmurs here and there over the past several years of developing a nuclear capability. I wrote a paper on that several years ago in which I pointed out that Japan could develop its own atomic weapon within a matter of months. It's got all the materials, it's got the technology. All it needs is the political will. If China gets too froggy, Japan could very well do that. They are already talking openly about first strike capability against North Korea. So to me, we're in a hard place. We need to develop our alliances more fully. NATO, which is ground-based contiguous nations, I don't think is a good analogy for what concerns us in Asia today.
Well, great. We only have a couple of minutes left. So let me just pose the final question. And if you could just wrap up quickly. And, what can we in Montana do? What is it incumbent on us to do in terms of being informed, being active, and taking the next steps in doing all we can to support the U.S. in this area?
Oh my. I would say that we're making a good start here by having this first take. I hope to have this followed by others in other areas around the world. Certainly Asia is my area of focus, as it was Mike Mansfield's. But to continue along with educating the people as to how international affairs affect them. For example, trade. A lot of wheat from Montana winds up in South Korea. So we have a kind of an economic interest in South Korea. Consumers all over the world have an economic interest in both Japan and Korea. So we need to educate people that world events do affect us. To paraphrase what Stalin said, or was it not Stalin, it was, Steve, you'll have to correct me on this, Marx, perhaps, or Engels. You may not be, Lenin, it was Lenin. You may not be interested in the world, I'm paraphrasing, but the world is certainly interested in you. If we can increase that awareness of our general citizenry, perhaps we can bring to bear a bit of political pressure on our elected representatives to do a far better job than they currently do in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, well, let me just reinforce that in conclusion and say that Mike Mansfield, before he was in Congress, was a professor of Far Eastern history at the University of Montana. And I think throughout his career in Congress and as an ambassador, continued to be an educator. And using his education and his knowledge, often confronted policies, including, for example, in the Vietnam War, which the administration did not accept his advice, but the need for an educated citizenry is part of what the Mansfield Center is all about. And we can strengthen our own education at every level, from primary school right through college, and be a better country for that, it seems to me.
Amen.
Well, that's a great way to end up. Thank you all for joining us today, and thanks to Bob and Steve for sharing your expertise. Again, if there is a topic for a first take that you'd like to see the Mansfield Center address, please message us through the website, and we're happy to hear your recommendations for speakers as well. So thank you all, and take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.